Good afternoon. I'm Chris Clark, President and CEO of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. And I want to welcome you to our Thursday Recovery and Resiliency Town Hall meeting. We're having these every week, and I hope that you'll continue to join us. A couple of updates before we get started. We've got a great conversation today with you on consumer confidence. I did this yesterday on our Resiliency Roundtable, but I do want to read part of a statement that the Georgia Chamber issued yesterday with the Atlanta Black Chambers and the Georgia Greater Black Chamber of Commerce. Our organizations will be part of a dialogue that does not fear honest and sincere discussion about race and equality, one that builds an authentic, solid foundation for future generations. We will build a better Georgia that includes rather than excludes, and that continues to anchor Georgia as a premier talent destination, open and accepting for all. Nothing less than genuine equality can be considered success, because we must be a state that celebrates diversity while working tirelessly to mitigate disparity. You can read the entire statement at gachamber.com/BLM statement. And if you care about these issues and you want to work with us, I encourage you to reach out and join us, part of our Diversity and Inclusion Council, which will meet tomorrow to discuss these issues and how the business community plays a role in healing this country and moving toward equality. So I hope that you'll be with us and join us on that. I also want to thank our good friend Santiago Marquez at the Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, who joins us today as a co-sponsor, and as always, our friends at Georgia News Network and Georgia Public Broadcast. Just as a couple of other announcements for you, on June 10th, we'll be holding our next Resiliency Roundtable, and this one will be fun. It'll be with the craft brewers of Georgia to learn what they did during the pandemic and how they're recovering. Also today, the Georgia Chamber on our website, gachamber.com/COVID-19, will be releasing the latest updates from what happened last night in the U.S. Senate, streamlining PPP and hopefully improving recovery efforts for you and those companies that have received those funds. Also, I'll remind you that if you want to be part of our Resiliency Task Force, we'll start those meetings next week. And you just need to reach out to COVID-19@georgiachamber.com. and we'll get you registered there. The discussion today that we're going to have is on an issue that I hear more and more about from our members, and that's how do you restore consumer confidence? How do you make the public feel safe flying again, going to baseball games again, going to hotels, going back into your retail business? And there's a lot of research on there, and we turn to our good friends at Morning Consult to give us a global perspective and talk about what's happening in the South. I do want to tease you a little bit and tell you that the Georgia Chamber is working with a great Georgia Chamber member on a new platform that will help your employees and customers gain consumer confidence coming back into your facilities. We'll tell you more about it next week, but if the training component of making sure your employees are ready, making sure that the public knows that you're prepared for them, if those issues matter to you, reach out and we'll get you on that list, and we'll talk to you more about it next week. So with no further ado, I want to introduce our two speakers today. Kyle Drop is coming to us from from New York. He is the Chief Research Officer and co-founder of Morning Consult, and John Lear is an economist for Morning Consult. These guys lead literally one of the foremost research and consumer confidence survey company in the world. We've used them for years and years and work with them, and from everything from politics to how we position Georgia to be a place that's welcoming to talent from around the world. They're our go-to organization. The likes of Nike and IBM and Coca-Cola and so many other great companies use them and trust their insight and their data every single day. So you got a real special treat today, and get out your pen and paper because they're going to give you a lot of good information. So with that, Kyle, John, I'll turn it over to you and look forward to hearing from you today. Thanks for being with us.
Chris, and thank you for having us. And John and I are grateful to have an opportunity to share some of the insights that we're working to produce. As you may know, but some others might not, we're a global data intelligence firm, and we're interviewing tens of thousands of people every day on different economic and brand and political and policy topics. And we're eager and looking forward to share some of those with you today. I'm going to give a quite brief introduction here. I'm going to share a few pieces of info on COVID-19 and coronavirus and how consumers are reacting to it from how they're spending their time, their money, and levels of concern. And then John, who's our chief economist, is going to show some really incredible info on consumer confidence and the economic trends that we're seeing. If you go one ahead, John. Yeah, so I think the core problem that we're trying to solve as an organization is we're trying to share data in real time with executives so they can make smarter decisions. So we're doing our best to help collect, organize, and share information. I mentioned, if you go one slide forward, that if you go one slide forward ahead, we have access to tens of millions of adults globally. So we're often able to collect info often before anybody else has it. We focus a lot on visualization, as you'll see in the slide, and everything we do is focused on getting the right answer and to be a trusted source. So we have had the opportunity to work with all sorts of media partners, whether it's the New York Times or Bloomberg or the Hollywood Reporter or Ad Age. I think without further ado, I'm going to talk a bit about, if you go one slide forward, John, some of the work that we're doing on coronavirus and COVID-19 now. I would highlight that much of this is freely available at our site, morningconsult.com. And in particular, we have roughly 200 public studies that is, to the best of my knowledge, the most comprehensive accounting of how adults, whether it's Americans or people in Georgia or people around the world, are being affected by the current outbreak. And this slide, for example, looks at the level of concern among adults, the percent who say they're very concerned about the coronavirus outbreak, and we've broken it down by generation. We've been tracking this since the turn of the year, early January, and so you can see in the slide that overall concern, this black line, peaked in late March, around March 30th, and it's sort of been trending down a little bit. I would also highlight that younger adults, this kind of green line, were often less concerned, but now they have similar levels of concern as adults across different generation groups, whether it's Gen Z or millennials or boomers. If you go one forward, every week we've stood up an index where we're asking consumers how comfortable they are with a range of actions and also when they expect to do so. We hope that this is uniquely valuable for, frankly, any company across sector, whether it's folks in the food and beverage world or airlines or hotels or you name it. So this slide, for example, we asked people when they expect a range of actions to happen. I would highlight that about half of people expect stores to open up in the next month. This is nationally, and then public going outside more, about 46%, and then you yourself being comfortable. I would highlight this gap here that people observe stores and organizations opening. However, it's about making people feel comfortable in a safe way to do that, and it is something that comes up often in our data, and that John will be able to highlight in our extensive consumer confidence tracking. On this next figure, and we're releasing this all publicly on our site, we've been asking adults every single week whether they would be confident and comfortable doing a range of activities. Everything from, on this slide in the purple, going out to eat, which tends to be the activity that adults feel most comfortable with. You can see, for example, since early April, it's more than doubled in terms of the percent of people nationwide who say they'd be comfortable. One notch below that would be going to a shopping mall. That's the purple line there. And then we have everything from going to gym, which would be in the red line there on the right-hand side, percent of people who feel comfortable doing so within the next month, and a wide range of actions. So frankly, any action that you might be interested in understanding what consumers are thinking, we're likely to have info on it. Again, I would highlight that these numbers are far from 100%, and that anything that the business community can do to bolster confidence is going to be welcome. We certainly have plenty of info on that. If you go one slide forward, John, we asked people how appropriate it would be for a range of businesses to open up in their community. Sort of top to bottom, you can see this is sort of linked with the level of comfort. So people want retailers and hair salons and restaurants to open. They think it's appropriate. And then kind of anything that involves large population density or cramped spaces, such as concert venues or sports venues, kind of one notch below that. the final figure that I'll show before handing off the baton to John is, we've done a lot of work on, how helpful a range of activities might be in terms of, responding to the virus. 6 and 10 say be very helpful for companies and corporate executives, to rehire employees, donations to food banks. I think this speaks to a broader theme in our work. What we're trying to do is get real info and real-time info in front of executives so they can think about how to react in a way that, is in line with their values, but also in line with what folks think. I know we have done a lot of work on the protests just over the past few days on what people think companies should do. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to John.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So I will be fairly brief here. The focus of my presentation is on the U.S. consumer. I say U.S. consumer outlook because it's not a forecast per se. The investor Howard Marks has a great line that no one can forecast, but we can and should do a better job of understanding the current situation. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to describe what we see in our near real-time data. So the focus of this presentation is on consumer confidence. What we do every day is we ask 6,000 Americans 5 questions related to their views of their personal financial conditions and business conditions in the country as a whole. And we track those answers over time on a daily basis. And so what you can see for the country is that the country's experienced a really traumatic event in March. The pandemic hurt consumers, it hurt their personal finances, they lost jobs, they lost confidence in business conditions in the country as a whole. They have gradually rebounded beginning in mid-April. One of the cool things about our data is not only can we look at this sort of aggregate picture, but we can also dive in and look at some of the underlying geographic and demographic breakouts, which, as we know, this country, it's a big country, but these special demographics and geographic regions experience events differently. So what we've done here is we've gone ahead and looked at state level consumer confidence beginning January 1, updated here every 15 days. And there are a couple things that stand out. The first is that consumer confidence has fallen dramatically across the board in every state, period. The second thing, though, to note is that the timing and the severity of that fall varied by state to state. So consumer confidence tends to be a really good indicator of consumer spending and the level of confidence that consumers have in the economy. And so this roughly tracks, how they're planning on making longer term big purchases. Now, since we're focused here on Georgia and the Georgia Chamber, I wanted to just highlight what we're seeing in some of the southern districts. So I've broken out the data by 3 census divisions that focus on these southern states. In the left panel, that includes Georgia and the South Atlantic, and then we have the East South Central and West South Central. A couple things jump out. The first, of course, is that Georgians in general tend to be more confident than their peers in other states in the South. The second point is that consumer confidence in Georgia did not fall as sharply as it did in some of the other states in the South Atlantic. But what's really interesting is that since April 15th, consumers in Georgia have not experienced the same rebound in confidence that you've seen in other states, most notably Florida in the South. There's been a really dramatic, I think, a 5% increase in consumer confidence in Florida over that period of time. So what we're seeing here is that there was a dramatic shock to the economy. Everyone during that period of time reacted roughly the same, but now as the recovery starts, the pace and speed of that recovery really differs from state to state. I'm going to highlight a few demographics that I think are probably also relevant for this group, and then I'll conclude with a couple forward-looking remarks. So we also track a wide range of demographics. One of them is age. This is interesting for a couple reasons. First of all, as you might expect, younger consumers did not grow as pessimistic about the economy as some of the older consumers. That's likely due to a combination of factors, both the fact that they're less vulnerable to the outbreak, and also that they have a longer time horizon to make up any of the losses in wealth or income, as opposed to older Americans who are nearing retirement, and they really don't have that time to make up whatever they've lost in income or wealth. It's also worth noting that there seems to be some sort of a level effect in that 45-year-olds and above have reacted very similarly to the shock, whereas these younger groups have all responded differently. We have a few minutes left, so I have an income breakout and a wealth. I'm going to jump through here to homeowners, renters, and rural, urban, suburban. Again, this is a finding. This is the nice thing about having daily data, that we can sort of just measure what's going on in the economy as opposed to relying on some theory. And so what we see is that suburban households really grew much less confident than their urban and rural counterparts. That again is somewhat surprising, considering how you would think population density limits economic activity in those urban areas more so than the suburban areas. And then finally, if you start thinking about the future, consumer confidence is an indicator of how consumers are feeling about making those large purchases, and much of that comes from their ability to make those purchases, to have the income, the discretionary spending, to pull the trigger on making large purchases. So what we're seeing in some of our sort of spec work related to jobs is that there are, for a lot of Americans who are, particularly those who are on unemployment insurance, they are not receiving the income they're receiving from unemployment insurance is not covering what they used to make prior to the beginning of this recession. That means a couple things. It means that they're not going to be able to have that money to go out and make those purchases. And then there's also some concerns around job instability for folks who still are employed. Over the next 4 weeks, there's 31% of American workers who are currently employed fear that they're going to lose their job or have their pay negatively affected over the next 4 weeks. So that informs my outlook and leads me to believe, based on what we see now in the economy, that we're really headed for sort of a very long, gradual road back. Here we have a little spec polling on some of the payment protection program, which I can dive into later. I'll wrap things up by saying, as we saw in that graph, consumers in March were really suffered dramatically in terms of a loss of confidence, but we do see some interesting heterogeneity across age and regions. The jobs market, as we'll learn tomorrow more definitively, but the job situation has really been a drag on overall consumer spending. And going forward, the question of what this recovery ultimately looks like for most consumers will depend on how Congress decides to address the issue of stimulus spending, and then also sort of how long people remain out of the workforce and what their attachment to their prior employer looks like. With that, I'll turn it back to Chris and Santiago.
Go ahead, Santiago. I know you've got a question about this, or you want to switch the topics a little bit, or we can go back and forth. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you guys. Phenomenal work, and this is really very valuable information. And I want to thank the Georgia Chamber for the work they're doing. We've been modeling a lot of what we've been doing after the Georgia Chamber. So thank you for your leadership on that. My question is, given what's been happening over the last 5 days, with the racial tensions that we have seen and the protests and, some of the riots, do you have information on that? Have you guys been able to gather information? And can you tell us something about the information that you've gathered, the sentiment, the information that you've been able, what is the analysis based on that info?
Certainly. Over the weekend on Sunday, we ran a large national study, and we found it quite comprehensive on the nationwide protests in dozens of cities. And in fact, we have multiple studies in the field right now, as given the quick changing nature of the events. I would highlight a few things. One, everyone's seeing it over 8 and 10, seen a lot or heard a lot about it. By a 2-to-1 margin, people see the protests as getting bigger over time rather than kind of the size of the protests as having already peaked. We asked what companies can do and what people might think of dozens of company actions. I would highlight that people view it as appropriate for a CEO to take actions here. Of all the actors in a company, they say it's most appropriate for a CEO to act. Across dozens of actions, adults were highly supportive of companies starting racial sensitivity programs, making small or other tailored donations to small businesses or local communities. There's much more there, and I would highlight that we on our site have released all of this info, also broken down by race and by age. For example, often support for the protesters and police will be different by racial lines. So those are a few things that we're doing, and we would keenly encourage anybody who perhaps wants to better understand what people are thinking that we're always in the field trying to get real-time info. So happy to add questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. And we definitely might want to circle back once some more of that data comes in to come back and share with our members, because this is an issue we're going to continue to work on. But let's go back to the recovery for a minute. I'm curious, you guys have done a lot of great research that we've used on generational thoughts and feelings, particularly on Gen Z and where they are. I'm curious, as you look at consumer confidence, John, what is the breakdown so far by generational shift? I mean, are the Zoomers ready to come back before the Millennials? Are they a little more tentative? Are the Boomers back? Yeah. What do we see?
Yeah, so in general, we see is that older consumers, so anyone over 45, that's going to be the Boomers, people as they're nearing retirement age. They lost confidence more. They lost more confidence more dramatically than younger Americans, and that's. I guess up front, it's not really clear why that would be, but looking at the data now, it's the benefit again of measuring things as opposed to using some theory, is that you can see that these younger Americans weathered the storm better than some of their older counterparts. Again, that's likely because they're not as the health risks are not quite the same for younger Americans as they are for older Americans, and then also they have a longer time horizon, right, to make up. If they're unemployed or laid off, they have more time between now and retirement to make up that difference.
You said, did you say 45? Did I hear you right?
Yeah. So that was somewhat surprising, is that you would think maybe that people 65 and above and 55 to 65 react very differently. But what we're seeing is that anyone over 45 responded essentially identically. So there seems to be some sort of a calculation by Americans at around that age that they share similar risk profiles and then sort of life retirement expectations.
And I would highlight too that before, I would say in early February in John's data, there really aren't huge differences across age in terms of consumer confidence, a couple points perhaps, but now 15 to 20 points from the youngest to the oldest generation. So really about as wide of a gap as you see, even larger than the gap now, or ever between, say, homeowners and renters. So
yeah.
I don't know that we saw anything, and if I missed this, forgive me. You guys gave so much detail, which was great. What about on the recovery in terms of different demographics, in terms of ethnicity or race? Representing the Hispanic community in particular, have you been able to get a feel or beat on what's the sense of the recovery, for let's say the Hispanic community?
I'd say a couple things. First of all, this is a great sort of promotion for a report I'll be coming out with next week that focuses on how consumer confidence across race and ethnicity has responded to COVID and this sort of ongoing racial tensions in America right now. In general, what we see is that, unfortunately, race tends to be highly correlated with income. And so many of the differences across let's say between white, African American, and Hispanic consumers closely mirror those differences across income breakouts, with wealthier and white consumers exhibiting a higher level of confidence than their African American and Hispanic counterparts.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things that we continue to struggle with is how you make that person feel comfortable when they come back in to your restaurant or to your store. Have you done any research that says if I see someone in a face mask, I feel safer, or if I see someone in gloves, or if I see some sign up that these people have had training? Any insight there for, particularly for our small businesses who are trying to figure this out without all of the support that they would, you know, a large company might be able to access?
Yeah, we've done extensive research on that, and you know, to be explicit, we've tried to understand, you know, what are the concrete actions companies that are, let's say, in the hotel industry or live events world or airlines industry or retailers can do to build confidence. I would highlight we have some public reports out on whether people would be more or less comfortable with some actions. I would say hand sanitizer dispensers widespread is usually quite high. Infrared thermometer screenings does tend to build comfort. We asked that in the context of going back to stadiums. You know, the idea of more space tends to appeal to a lot of folks. So whether that's filling stadiums partially or additional seats or work in between. With respect to movie theaters, sort of the actions that would lead people to be most likely to do it would be, you know, again, sanitized high touch areas, sanitizing seats in between movies, staggering seats, and capping attendance. Contact-free payment methods are also up there. So, you know, our hope is that for any industry that is affected here, that we can tailor specific actions or better understand the actions that will, you know, help these businesses get back to normal, or a new normal at least.
And I would add quickly, you know, that from a sort of a macro perspective, what's really interesting, and I'm sure that members of the Georgia Chamber can appreciate this, but on the one hand, right, you're trying to adopt these measures to bring consumers in. A lot of them deal with cutting down capacity or some other additional cost. And so there is this sort of new profit maximization function that firms face in terms of understanding how to both bring in consumers while also understanding the downside risk to their profit.
Santiago, time for one last question if you've got one.
I do have one. Thank you. And so remembering what you went through here in terms of the data, and I believe one of the things that you said is that I think it was 31% of the people believe that their jobs could be in jeopardy over the next 4 weeks. Do you have any sense if that's tied to the fact that a lot of those companies have gotten PPP and they think that maybe PPP is running out, or why is it just because the way the economy and the unemployment numbers are heading, or is there any sense of why that number is what it is?
So regarding PPP, what we found in a separate finding there is that we ask a lot of folks who have already been placed on temporary leave whether or not they're receiving any income or pay during that period of time, and a shocking number, 70% said no, they are not. So that's sort of a red flag in terms of understanding the efficacy of PPP. For the job instability, I think a lot of it comes back to the issue that I raised earlier, which is that, you know, I believe workers are essentially smart. They understand what's going on, what the operating environment is, particularly for folks who are working an hourly service job. You know, their productivity outlook is likely diminished in the near term. For a given worker now, the costs are going to be higher as businesses deal with, you know, cutting capacity and other sort of measures required to make consumers feel comfortable.
Well, guys, thank y'all. This has all been great information. So, Kyle, tell our viewers and those that might be following us later, where can they go to get the latest updated information and research that you guys put out?
thank you again. You can go to morningconsult.com for most of this information free. And then I would also note that we have roughly 10 morning email newsletters that are completely free and probably the most informative info I get each day.
And I thank you for those, Kyle, because I get them every day too, and I appreciate it. And your website is one of those that I have on my bookmark at the top of the page to go to every day to see your latest information. And I encourage our viewers and those with the Georgia Chamber to do the same. I want to thank John and Kyle for being with us in Santiago and the Georgia Hispanic Chamber as always for your incredible partnership. Hope for you to join us next week for our Resiliency Roundtable, where we'll feature Deloitte, our good friend and partner, as well as our craft brewers. And don't forget to go to gachamber.com/COVID-19 for the latest updates. Thank you all, and continue to create jobs for Georgia, and God bless. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Nice job.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Kyle.